Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar this afternoon. My name is George Florentine. I'm the VP of Technology at Flatirons Digital Innovations, and we're very happy to have you with us here today on this webinar on best practices for healthcare providers, sponsored by the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council. So I want to thank them for providing an opportunity for us to share our best practices. Before we dive in, I wanted to do some brief intros. I'm George speaking. That good-looking young gentleman on the left, and then the two better-looking gentlemen are Brad Ricks, who's a colleague of mine here in Boulder, who has done a number of projects on data archiving and is one of our lead architects, and my colleague in the Dallas area, Frank Hughes, who's got a deep experience base in healthcare, both on the customer provider side, patient side, and also in IT. So the three of us will be chatting with you today. I'm very excited about the opportunity to talk to you about some of the best practices we've developed. So we'll dive in. Okay, today our agenda is really focused on, first off, defining what data archiving is. There's a lot of different definitions out there, so we thought it would be helpful to give you what kind of our definition is. What particular types of applications and data we see healthcare providers archiving. Most importantly, what are the benefits for our customers and our partners in the healthcare industry, whether you're a clinician, whether you're working in compliance, whether you're on the finance side, and of course IT supporting all those functions. So we've got discussions on what we see are benefits for all those different aspects to the business. And then we'll talk about some best practices. Brad will lead this conversation on what we've seen in the area of data integrity, on security, functionality of the archive, and then Frank will wrap us up with some common questions and some things he's seen as he's been talking to our customer and healthcare partners. Let's start on what we see going on in terms of the whole application lifecycle. We see customers starting with applications that are typically created in the business. They're doing ideation, project creation, building the application, and then it kind of transitions into the bottom area, which is typically maintained by IT, and they do deployment and they do maintenance. Eventually, they'll start doing infrastructure refresh, and over time, a few years, several years, a decade, 2 decades, what we see is this ever-increasing burden in the IT organization of an application inventory. It ends up costing the company more and more every year to maintain these applications. They'll have domain experts and technology experts that may leave the company. We've seen customers who have applications that are not even quite sure what they do anymore. I know that sounds kind of strange, but if you've run an application for 25 years and it's been across multiple technology refreshes, that can actually be a problem. And so we see this arrow gets bigger and bigger with less value to the organization, more IT cost. So we see this data and application life cycle across a number of our customers. And what we see happening is that over time, it takes more and more of the IT spend to just run the business. And our research and talking to our customers, we see that up to 70% of their annual IT budget is basically just spent keeping the lights on. And in that situation, IT is not valued by the business. There's not competitive advantage from the IT provisioning. They end up having to do this large spend just to keep the lights on. And there's an ever-increasing spend in the business to say, wow, I'm spending more and more money, and I'm actually getting less value. So it creates a lot of conflict between the business and IT. And what we see are sort of forward-thinking, leading-edge customers and partners in healthcare is they're rechanging that model, and they're looking to retire, archive applications, and this frees up money. So you see this pie on the right looks much more interesting. They can take money and put it back in innovation. They can take operational money that was just spent doing maintenance and build new applications. And so this leads to competitive advantage. It makes IT and the business more business partners, and in general speeds up the ability to get into new markets. It improves the quality of service that you provide to your patients or to your partners in your healthcare practice. And both IT and business end up providing better value to the leadership team of the company. And so really that's the, if you look at the major driving goal that we see in most of our partners and customers, it's really this desire to improve the competitive advantage, to really provide great cost recovery, improve quality of care to their patients, because they're spending more time on new applications, more time on innovation, less time on maintaining legacy applications that may have outlived their usefulness. So now I want to, before we go into details on what we've seen, we want to talk about what is data archiving. And so we see this sort of dichotomy in the market where people will say, oh, I'm just going to do long-term storage. I'm just going to put it into my backup, or maybe I'll put it into some disaster recovery environment. They don't expect to ever get at it, and in a timely fashion, it's basically the file and forget tool. And we find people say, oh, okay, I'm done thinking about that. And what we typically say to them is, well, really, you're missing out on some opportunities, and you're increasing risk. And so we talk to people and say, you really ought to think about data archiving. So our definition of that is migration of static data out of production systems or outdated legacy applications into an archiving platform. And the important requirement for a lot of this data is that you still need to get at it. You may have a legal requirement, you may have a regulatory requirement, it might be a request of information, it might be a RAC audit, and you have to get at this data, and you have to get at it in a relatively timely fashion, and you absolutely have to be able to get at it. We've seen customers who have used their backup strategy as their long-term retention policy. They have a need to go get the data, and the backup no longer works. And that can cause very significant business exposure financially and risk to the company. So that's not a great approach. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is some of the things when we chat with people. We'll say, hey, we see there's an opportunity for you to improve how you run your business. You can do some cost recovery. And some of our partners in healthcare will say, well, really, this application isn't broken. It isn't used much, and therefore, why change something that's not broken? And they say, we're just not going to do anything. We might turn off our maintenance for our expensive databases. We might put it on hardware that's not too expensive because we've already CapEx the hardware. And so, do nothing is zero risk. And we say, well, if you think through this, it's certainly understandable that that might be your first thought. But what we say when we talk to people, when we work with our customers and partners, is you're not looking at an assessment of applications. So you as IT are providing less and less value to the business, and so business loses faith in IT. May go out and create shadow IT organizations in order to move their needs forward. That always ends up with problems down the road. They are running on aging infrastructure, and so obviously if you're running on, we've seen customers who have one full-time person, and all they do is they spend time on eBay trying to buy old hardware, because they realize that they can't buy the hardware new. If they have a hardware failure in a disk drive or a controller, they can't run the app anymore. So they're basically doing the equivalent of, looking in, basically hardware junkyards to try and keep their applications running. That obviously eventually isn't going to work. And as I mentioned before, some people will use backup technologies. And as we all know, backups frequently fail, especially if they've not been accessed in a long time. And then there's huge risk. You fail an audit, it may eventually result in you not being able to provide your services in a region or a state, maybe lots of financial implications for a failed audit. So really expensive to the business. And so really we see that doing nothing is actually quite high risk for all these reasons. When we start doing this application assessment, the world gets much better. We see that we look at applications, we can right-size those applications. We see a lot of our customers doing lift and shift, going from on-prem, older technology platforms into cloud-based, whether it's public or public-private or private clouds. And this is a great opportunity to think about application decommissioning and data archiving. You get away from these inefficient infrastructure refreshes where you're having to go, again, find old hardware or trying to run on outdated operating systems. We've seen customers who are running on aged operating systems, and then someone will come out with what's called a zero-day security hole, and you actually can't fix it without upgrading the operating system. So now you've got a mission-critical app for your data retention and business continuity, you've got a 0-day risk, and compliance says, oh my gosh, we can't be running with a 0-day risk. And IT says, well, I can't fix this because I'm running on an old version of Windows NT or an old version of MVS, and I can't actually apply a patch. And so now IT gets in this very bad position. Compliance gets in a very bad position because they have to go up to the leadership team and say, we've identified a 0-day risk. IT doesn't know how to fix it without a very significant refreshing infrastructure. And now we have to go and we have to talk to regulatory agencies. We may have to talk to our customers and tell them we have the 0-day security risk and we can't quickly fix it. And that's really a bad place to be as an IT provider and as a business. Business and IT end up not aligned on the application value, and there's really no governance. And so things just continue to get slower and slower and slower. So really, application assessment, we think, is very important. And so if you look at the type of data that healthcare providers will archive, we see it in a number of places. We see people doing a lot of work with EMRs and EHRs, whether they're migrating from older solutions to newer solutions, whether you're migrating up to an Epic or to a Cerner or to some other system. You still have information in these old EMRs that you need to maintain for continuity with your customer and your patients. Patient and accounting systems, obviously, you need to be able to go back and continue to do AR burn down to collect monies you're owed, but you want to get off an old system. We see some of these past systems that cost people millions of dollars a year, and they're desperate to recover that cost. HR systems are part of the deal. We see this a lot when people will do mergers and acquisitions. They acquire a number of clinics, they acquire other hospitals, and all those HR systems need to be consolidated. You have people that are coming over, you're putting them in a new payroll system, you're putting them in a new benefit system, but you may need to keep some of that old data. Homegrown systems, obviously, are all over the place. We still see lots of people that are running mostly financial side of the house, running in mainframes. We see people trying to do data center consolidation, again, moving to the cloud. We've seen people say, hey, we're spending $5 million a year in this data center. We have to get out of the data center, but we can't because no one knows how to run this MVS based operating system solution that's running in Kix, and no one knows how to maintain it. And so now we're stuck holding onto a building we want to get rid of because of one application. So that's all really good motivation for us to get to these new systems. So if we look at the sides of the business that benefit from this, we see really value across a whole variety of folks in your organization. First of all, clinicians, if you've been involved in any migration of EMRs and EHRs, a lot of the new systems will only allow you to take a year or two of data. That's almost always not enough. Someone comes in and says, hey, you provided me with some healthcare service for my broken collarbone 10 years ago, and for either a HIPAA requirement or something, I need to see what that care was. And so you have to have that data. And that allows you to both provide better patient care and also continue to provide value without having to say to the patient, hey, I'm sorry, we don't understand how to treat you because we don't see that data from 5 years ago. You've re-injured your shoulder, but we can't look at the old data, so we don't know what to do with you. Obviously, on the compliance side, someone comes for a request of information, a release of information, and they say, I want to go back. Anything you've ever provided for me as a patient, or anything that a provider has provided, or anything that has been done at a facility, and we need to be able to respond to those audits well. So the folks in compliance and health information management are really excited about these opportunities to get these older archive systems into easier access technology stack. I already talked a little bit about finance, ability to reduce costs. We see CFOs coming around to IT into the business and saying, we're still spending a lot of money on bricks and mortar at old data centers. We're spending a lot of money on operating systems and databases. We're spending a lot of money maybe to lease some software. And we want to put that money into strategic projects. And so finance gets really excited about this. And then finally, IT really likes this because no one in IT likes to be presented with a requirement to provide value, and then they can't do it because they don't understand the technology anymore or the hardware has failed. And so IT has been really responsive to this because it allows them to provide better value to the business, which everyone in IT is always feeling like, hey, we're kind of the low person on the totem pole. We can never provide enough value. And so this really helps IT become more of a business partner. which everyone likes. So that's kind of the high-level overview of what we see going on in the market. At this point, I wanted to turn it over to my colleague Brad, who's been leading and architecting a number of our healthcare solutions over the last 5 years or so. And Brad will walk us through some of the kind of tips and tricks that his team have developed over our last several years of engagement. So Brad.
Thanks, George. So the first topic is just talking about kind of data integrity, because it's important, obviously, the data itself is want to make sure that you got everything that you had before. So we know in healthcare it's very important to not lose any of the data or patients. You don't want to have half a patient record. You want the whole record. So we want to make sure we have a complete system of record of everything for whatever the data was. So when we typically archive the data, we archive all the data from the source system. So if we're taking a system from a legacy database system, we'll pull all the tables and columns and pull all that out. And because sometimes we even have the needs where we'll pull it all out and maybe we'll only build reports on some of the data, but at least we have all of the data in case we have a report that we need to build on other data off of that as well. So it gives us, it kind of helps future-proof that to make sure even if you didn't need some of it now, you might need some of it later. We then do verifications to ensure that we have all that data. So we basically do record counts, things to ensure that every piece of data that we had before in the old system, we recount it after we bring it into an archive and confirm that we've got the exact same data. We didn't lose anything.
One of the funny things I wanted to share with our webinar participants is I've watched your team do this. And frequently, you're uncovering kind of flaws that might have crept into the application over the years, that there might have been a patch that didn't enforce data integrity. And so I've seen your team say, and I know, this might sound a little scary, but this is sort of the real world of someone says, hey, I've got 2 million images in the database, and they're only hooked up to 1.998 patient records. So we might have 20,000 or 50,000, what we would say, orphaned images. So how does that conversation look with the customer? You say, hey, we've done all our chain of custody integrity testing. We're really looking to make sure we've got everything. And gee, we found out the source app actually had some kind of software bug, or maybe it was a hardware failure or whatever. How do you handle that kind of dialogue with your project sponsor or the customer that you work with?
Well, I mean, first, as you did point out, we usually give them the counts, and we'll say how many are missing one direction or the other, and we may have pointers to images that don't exist or images that don't have pointers to them. So we may have both sides of those. And so we'll do that, and usually we'll replicate that in the legacy application and kind of show the customer to show that it's not just our problem, and say, look, your old systems can't pull up these records as well. And often the old systems don't actually handle them very well when they're missing. They produce particular bad error messages. So we can actually provide value because we can then for the images where we might have, like in that particular example you gave, an image that has a link that's missing, the image is missing, we can at least provide feedback to the end user and say, this image is missing, but there was this pointer to that. We might be able to enhance the system. In the other direction, we can produce a list of files and maybe a separate search or something that has all those files, the 300 files that were orphaned. And usually if you pull those up, typically they're going to have the patient information in them. So you'll know which patient it was. So we could provide an interface to display those if that's what the customer needed, or
right.
to utilize that data.
Yeah, and I think one of the, I guess, fun, because you and I both love this stuff. The fun thing is having that conversation with compliance, because when I think we have that conversation with compliance, it really makes them feel, oh, great, like we've really got someone who's looked at our data, and now I actually feel more comfortable because we don't have this 20-year-old, maybe a little bit crufty system. We've had world-class experts look at all our data. Where there's been a problem, I think typically we never change the data, but we can say we actually have a better view of your data than the old system. And so I think initially, when we first started doing this, we talked to the compliance team and they're like, oh my gosh, this is like the end of the world. And we're like, no, you actually now have a better handle on what your data is than before. And they're like, oh yeah, that's great. So when I have an audit, I can actually show this report that says we've looked at every single record of every single patient. And in cases where we had some, and there are always problems in software, but at least we know. And so I think it's been kind of fun to watch that kind of maturation and how the compliance team says, okay, now I get it. Now I see the value, and now I actually feel better if I get an audit I can pull this out of my hip pocket and say, everything's here. Oh, by the way, as part of our due diligence of providing great quality of care and great quality of infrastructure, we found this issue, we've resolved it. And, and we've never, to my knowledge, Frank, we've never failed an audit on the system. And that we're really proud of that, right? Everybody who comes and looks at it comes away saying, and we've worked with some very big healthcare providers and some very big financial services, banks, and they are very, very, very interested in data integrity. So I think your team has done a great job of proving our expertise in that area. So it's been fun to watch.
Yeah, and just the last point on there is just that when we do the archives, we typically move the data after it's been read-only. If depending on the kind of system, if you're legacy, we might be able to start building the archive ahead of time, but when we're eventually ready to do that, they kind of wait till they're read-only and then we extract the whole data. One of the challenges is if you're trying to get part of a patient record and later say, oh, I want to get the remaining part of the patient record, because the legacy systems often intertwine that data all over. So it's best to wait till after to at least data extract.
Right, so that's a good governance tip, right? It's really hard to take something that's 98% in use and say, oh, we'll take the 2% later, where the 2% might be a spider web touching the whole infrastructure,
and
right?
You don't know the legacy system where that might be,
right,
where the 2% rise. So
right.
You're having to take the whole thing again. So.
Yeah.
So the next thing is on security. What we typically do is, obviously security is paramount, right, in healthcare industries. I mean, we don't want to have anybody take a chance of accessing the wrong data. So one of the things we do is most of the archives we built around Active Directory. We integrate with existing Active Directory systems, and we make security groups for each of the systems or each of the groups involved. And we typically make those fairly simple. The legacy systems are often very complex because they have different upgrade groups. So certain levels of nursing can update certain fields. And so IT organizations have to maintain, 100 different user groups in the Active Directory. But we typically, have found that organizations, if they keep it simple, it's much easier for them to maintain. So we might say, since this is read-only, they can have access to clinical data, or at least most of the clinical data. And if there's some more detailed information like Social Security numbers, then maybe HIM users can see those.
Right.
And then financial people who have access to that can see financial data. And so that's common. We'll have 3 to 5 groups. And it's obviously depending on each customer's model.
Yep.
On that.
The other thing, I just wanted to riff off of that for a minute. What I've seen your groups do, and it's been kind of interesting to watch, is you come and you start talking to the customer. You start, very quickly showing them this new user interface experience. You maybe find some data, that was a little bit inconsistent. And then they get all excited and they say, wow, you're going to build me a new EMR. And this is awesome, right? I want all my data, and I want every feature in the book. I want all the system integrations. I want update. And so, talk to me a little bit about how you had an example here, a really good example, say, hey, you don't need 100 security groups if you're only doing read-only and there's only 3 classes of users. So talk to me about, what does that dialogue look like, and how do you find a champion that says to the customer, hey, it's an archive. It has, these set of user stories are super important, but, you don't want to rebuild a new EMR. First of all, it's super expensive. Second, you probably already migrated to a new EMR or a new patient accounting system. So how do you, people are like, oh, it's Christmas time. Here's my Brad who knows everything about this, and I just keep giving him requirements, and then he'll come back at some point and have a brand new system, and then, obviously that doesn't work financially, and it's not what we want to do. So how does that conversation work to kind of keep people in the box of saying, hey, this is an archive, let's get it done and move on to the next thing and get the cost recovery that we're all looking for?
Right. I mean, as you said, one of the things you definitely point out is to remind people, especially the users of the system is the primary people who want those features, and often the people who want to keep it simple are the IT directors, the VPs, the people who are financially, they want to keep the money, they want to keep the system simple. And so often we'd have to try and remind the people who are going to be using it and say, you realize a lot of these features you're asking for, you're probably not going to use when the data is 3 years old. You need it today because your data is live and you're using this, but that's what your current EMR is for. But in the old data, all you really need to do is pull it up and take a quick look at it and find out what your blood pressure was or your surgery results were in the past, but you don't need quite the same intricate view while you're in a hospital right now.
Right.
And when they start to see that, they start to understand that they realize that, they don't need quite the level.
Yeah, so I think the meta point I hear out of this is dialogue with multiple people in the organization is important. You've got the day-to-day, whether it's a clinician or someone on the audit side, but you also, it sounds like you need a champion one layer up who can gently say, hey, remember the goals of the project, remember the scope of the project. These guys are here to do a thing. If we want to do other things, that's great. That's another project. Let's hit the time, money, and function box that we all agree to. And so I think that's great. That's great advice.
Yeah, and then just one last minor point is audit logging. So we also keep track of audit logging, basically logging every query and view in the system. So like from if it's a clinical system of HIPAA compliance, for example, but every system has the same things to be able to say who saw what record, who saw my records, if I was a patient or vice versa, if I was a clinician, what records did I see? And so the audit log will track all that. So.
Right. Yep. Great.
And we touched on this a little bit, but I know you touched on this, George, beforehand. But one of the things we always start with is keep it simple. We want to show all your data. We want to show everything you got, but we don't need to reproduce the entire legacy application, right? You want to get people quick. You want speed, you want access to that data, and you want to see it all, but you don't quite need the bells and whistles that you had on all 17 different views of the data, depending on which type of person you were. Now you might need a couple different views of that data. Mm-hmm. So we tend to recreate what's needed. So, and the other one is the ability to export content. So, a specific example is release of information from an EMR perspective. But anytime you want to be able to get data out, to be able to export that data out, whether it gets it out to a PDF or something that has all the patient records for that, or whether it's financial data and getting back a
right. That's sort of the escape hatch, right? Typically the solutions I've seen your team build is like, here's the 5 reports that you're going to use most. But if you need a 6th report, either your IT team build it or you can export it to CSV and slice and dice it in Excel or whatever your data modeling tool is, or whether it's a document, maybe you print it out in a PDF. So I think that's, it gives them, when we walk away, they don't say, oh my gosh, this is the only thing I'll ever be able to get out of the system, right? So that's I think, important. So the next thing I wanted to do is have Frank walk us through some of the questions and conversations he's been having with our partners in the healthcare domain. So I'll turn it over to you, Frank, and maybe you can walk us through some of these kind of frequently asked questions we've seen.
Great. Thanks, George and Brad. Appreciate it. Just to shed a little light on some of my background, which I kind of think is important to the audience. I was the CIO of a healthcare provider organization for roughly 10 years. I've been on the professional services side, involved in very intense strategic projects related around master data management and things like that. And so being on the buy side and seeing the issues you guys have, I can relate to the fact of what some of the frequently asked questions are being formulated. But the reality is, it's much more expensive not to be compliant or support the legacy applications than it is to get the job done. And I'll kind of evaluate or elaborate on that a little bit moving forward. So cost, pretty simplistic model. It's a combination of volume of data, complexity of the data, the availability of your resources to assist in understanding the data. A lot of these older systems, it may be Bill been taking care of for years. Well, he just left the company and now it's been sitting there and nobody knows how to deal with it. So those kind of things kind of affect what the cost is. And we worked through that in the sales process to kind of get a measure of what that is so you get an understanding of it. Now you're looking at from a cost perspective, that also is kind of a variable that makes up how long does it take. It can go as simple as 4 to 6 weeks for an application, or it could take much longer for some of these larger applications with multiple instances and things like that. So it could stretch out over multiple years, or it could be just a single year. It really depends on, as we craft what our projects look like, what that project or the application decommissioning schedule will be. And what also can affect it is, are we doing all the work for you, or are we teaching you to fish, which kind of can reduce costs and allow your staff to take over that? We can work in either model, and we're very good at doing both. Additionally, how do you determine the project scope? That's really in line with the cost, which is Brad touched on it on the best practices on number 3, which is how much functionality you're actually going to bring over from the new system. One thing we really are adamant about with our clients is the KISS approach, which is keep it simple, stupid. There's no reason in recreating your old EHR because you really just need the basic information out of it. So the number of screens, the search criteria, indexes that may need to be, and things like that will determine the scope. Also, the volume of data and the changing of complexity between instances. Many of you may be aware in your installations where you may have all scripts installed in 80 different locations. However, as you go from location to location, how those encounter templates are set up within each application are different as you go from instance to instance. Granted, it's the same application, but however, when you change how that template works, that then becomes a little bit more complicated in synthesizing that data and getting it into the archive. Additionally, it's the volume of data. I'll state again, we actually try and target low-hanging fruit and trying to get it going. So we target those quick wins and then let the project itself build momentum as we move forward. What you need to know about the source data. That's crucial. It depends on the date or age of it. Some of these older systems, like I said before, poor Bill, he decided to leave and he took all the knowledge with him and there's no documentation. If there's documentation that resides, then that makes it a lot easier job for us to synthesize and kind of figure it out. If it's really crawling through the dark, then that kind of increases our scope. But thank God, so far that hasn't been a big problem so far. But we do find those one-offs where, unfortunately, that nobody's seen the application or the application's been sold to multiple different companies. And then in the instance of McKesson isn't even in the software business anymore. So tracking down those legacy documentation and things like that sometimes adds to the complexity of knowing the source data.
Great. Thanks, Frank. And thanks, Brad, for your insights. Through the course of this half hour, as we've been chatting, we have had a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. So I'm going to read these out, and then Brad and Frank and I will reply as appropriate. So here we go. First question that came in was, how long has Flatirons been performing data archiving and application decommissioning services? So I'm probably the old person on the team here in terms of time at Flatirons. So we have been engaged in this general space, I would say, for close to 20 years of looking at large structured content problems and how to migrate content, whether it's in aerospace or financial services or healthcare. Our particular application decommissioning service, we did our first engagement in 2011. So we're coming up on 7.5 years. I think it was in the summer of 11. So we'll be over half a decade. So it'll be 8 years this summer. So the next question that came in is, how many projects have we completed in the past year or two? So I'll open that up to Brad or Frank. I know each of you have had some insight. So what would you guys say is the kind of the velocity and the volume of work that we've done over the last couple of years?
So I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I've been personally involved with probably at least 8 different applications in the last year of being involved with. So over the course of the company, we're probably, probably do at least 20 applications a year, 20 to 40 applications a year, counting all the different companies that because each company we do multiple applications.
Right, and that's what I was going to say. It's interesting that as we get involved with different, customers, and as Frank said, keep it simple. We'll typically advise to start with something that's a little bit smaller because there's always little bits of issues on how are we going to do deployment or how do we talk to a domain expert or access to the system. And then, typically have a good first success and then move on to a new project. And maybe that next one's a little small and the next one's really big. And then there's another one. And then when we stop for 6 months. So yeah, that would be my guess as well, is it's probably about 20 to 25 a year across maybe, 6 to 8 customers at a time. So it's at velocity. And I think it's been good. What I've noticed too is every one of these projects we learn a little bit. So the first one, we're looking at a mumps technology, and I know you were, Brad, were one of the early folks inside the company looking at mumps. There's a lot of different flavors of mumps, and whether you're running on top of a cache or not. And so, again, we start to get some experience and velocity, and things go faster and faster. Okay, this next one, I think I'll throw out for you, Frank. I'll read it, and then maybe you can reply. What has been your experience of the average time for an organization to really, achieve the return on investment that they were thinking about? So we start a conversation, we think, hey, based on the scope, you're going to spend this amount of money and then you're going to return. I mean, what does that look like in your experience with the customers you've worked with?
It's a little bit dependent on the client and their activities. If I'm working with a client now, they literally within 2 months can save $260,000 a year by just decommissioning one application, which we're not even near that cost in order to take care of it. So the complexity of what the ROI is depends on the client. Another problem that's out there that we're seeing regularly in the healthcare space is people are just not paying maintenance and support at all, which leads to a compliance issue, which leads to the unknown cost of when you get audited and are found out of compliance and start getting fines. That can be huge. Or security break-ins because the applications are running on a platform that can't be locked down and data breaches occur with the patient record. Those costs aren't readily known up front, but you can see some of the examples out there in the marketplace where it's millions and millions and millions of dollars in fines from CMS related to data breaches. So that's kind of some of the complexities of the environment that make up what the true ROI is, but it can vary from client from for 2 months to a couple of years, or could be immediate as soon as you get an audit and you start getting fined.
Right. Yeah. So I think that what I hear you saying is there's a OPEX cost that's pretty easy to calculate. Then there's the risk factor, which when the risk hit you, it can be a giant 6 or 7 digit number. Those things are a little harder to quantify on a spreadsheet. But as you said, we've seen that happen. So we know it's real. One more for you, Frank. So what? Let's say I'm a partner, with you in the healthcare space, and I'm pretty excited about what we've been talking about today, and I want to get going. What do I need to do to bring to the table? Let's say we're going to do our first engagement. I'm going to bring in your team. What do I need as a clinician or an IT person, or maybe I'm in compliance and I'm funding this because I really want to get my risk under control. What do I need to bring to the table to make sure your team and my team is successful doing this first engagement together?
It's a little bit of everybody, right? So it's the clinician view of it, because they're the ones that have to use it and access it. It's an HIM department that they've got their use cases for it and then the user stories that we build related to it. Compliance has a huge play in this to make sure that it fits into their compliance, their rules and regulations and things like that. And then not to be misthought of, but the application expertise from the IT support perspective. A lot of groups have clinical applications teams that support them. And the more talent you have that still can participate as part of that will speed and help reduce the scope and speed getting the application actually decommissioned. So they're kind of the 4 main areas there.
Right. And I think it's interesting from a governance perspective, because what I see with the teams is we'll have an initial engagement and they're like, Brad, man, you know this stuff. Just do it and let us know when it's done, and we'll do a user acceptance test and we'll be off to the races. And I think in some sense, it's a great compliment to your team. On the other sense, I think what we realized is it's much better when you work in partnership. And so, I watch your teams and it's a balance, right? Because if you say, hey, we need 45 people in the room, they're like, oh gosh, I can't get all those people in the room. I can't get compliance and clinician and HIM and IT. So I think I've watched our team say, well, we're going to talk to compliance people one day. We'll just make sure, And so I think you're right, Frank, but it's all around the governance, right, of getting a touch point with these people so that we're doing the right thing, but also we want to be a force multiplier for them. We want to provide leverage, right? We don't want them to say, hey, you have to come to every daily meeting with us for 6 months, because they're going to say, gosh, if I'm going to do that, why don't I just do it, right? So I think we have to find that balance. Hey, we're running up against our time limit, but we do have one last question. It's for you, Brad, which is, there's lots of different data, obviously different main operating system platforms, different hardware, different types of data. What are your experience? So I'll put you on the spot here. What's hard? What types of data are harder than others? And why, why you're saying, oh, I got to see one of these, and it's a little bit trickier, and they need to be maybe more technologies, or maybe more time, or maybe, what does that look like? What's the hard data? And why would that data be, like scary or challenging?
Right. So, that usually kind of goes along with time. So the older data is usually on the older system. So it might be on mainframes or even a MUMP system, although those are still current as well. But the mainframes are becoming, obviously more out of date. And those are a bit more challenging just because the data storage is very different in that platforms. We have tools to convert data out of these old COBOL databases to pull the data out, but it's not as straightforward as, for example, taking something out of Oracle or SQL Server. Those tend to be
right. Relational databases got created for a reason, right? We started with file systems, then we're doing IMS, then we're doing IDMS, we're doing codicil, we're doing hierarchical. Right. We started doing relational, we started doing object modeling, now we're doing tuple store. So, right. The older it is, it's kind of like, well, it wasn't that good, or we still be using it, right? So that's a challenge for you.
So we just have to go through and sometimes trying to understand that data model in those legacy applications is challenging to find somebody who's a subject matter expert who knows where that field is. They might see a field on the screen, and where is it in the database, right? So if it's really, really old data on really old systems, that's sometimes tricky to find where is that data.
So it comes back to the mantra that we've talked about a little bit, is do nothing is actually not zero risk. Right, the longer you wait, it's sort of like not going to the dentist, right? At some point you're gonna have a very painful experience, right? Hey, that's great. We're a little bit out of time here, so I wanted to bring just wrap everything back up together. This has been a great conversation, Brad and Frank. Thanks so much and all of you in the webinar and the Dallas Healthcare Council. Thanks for sponsoring us. So we wanted to give you just sort of 3 takeaways. We think that archiving and application decommission are strategic initiatives. They're very important to your overall data management strategy. We see that with almost every customer we talk to. And this is kind of just simple, best practice. Start small. Don't boil the ocean. And finally, I wanted to leave you, if you get through this and you want more info, this was obviously a lot in 40 minutes, but we have lots of resources at our website, www.fdiinc.com, so 2 I's in there. And then again, our customer-facing, really healthcare domain expert on the call here is Frank. So you can copy down his contact info, and Frank probably has already talked to a bunch of you who are on the webinar today, but he's always interested in talking to new folks and learning more about what your opportunities or challenges are. So again, thank you very much to the DFW Council and to Brad and Frank. So I'll close it today, and everyone have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.